Look, everything you thought you knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls is about to get flipped on its head, because in 2024, archaeologists just made a discovery that's sending shockwaves through the entire religious and academic world. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this could literally rewrite thousands of years of biblical history. But here's the thing that nobody's talking about. This isn't just about finding some old pieces of paper in a cave. What they found challenges the very foundation of how we understand ancient Judaism, early Christianity, and the texts that billions of people base their entire lives on. So stick around, because what I'm about to show you is going to make you question everything you learned in Sunday school. Alright, so before we dive into this mind-blowing new discovery, we need to talk about what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually are. Picture this. It's 1947, and a young Bedouin shepherd is looking for a lost goat near the Dead Sea. He throws a rock into a cave, hears something break, and decides to investigate. What he finds inside changes everything we know about ancient texts. Inside these caves were clay jars containing scrolls that hadn't been touched in nearly 2,000 years. We're talking about manuscripts from around 200 BCE to 70 CE. These were biblical texts, religious writings, and community rules from a mysterious group that lived in total isolation. The scrolls included copies of almost every book of the Hebrew Bible, except for the Book of Esther. They also contained texts we'd never seen before, writings about the end times, strict religious laws, and prophecies that paint a completely different picture of what was happening during the time of Jesus. Now, here's where it gets interesting. For decades, scholars have been studying these scrolls, trying to piece together who wrote them and why. The most popular theory is that they belonged to a group called this ultra-religious Jewish sect that rejected the temple in Jerusalem and lived like monks in the desert. They believed the world was divided into the sons of light and the sons of darkness. They thought the end times were coming soon, and they needed to live in absolute purity to prepare for it. But not everyone agrees with this theory. Some scholars think the scrolls came from multiple groups. Others believe they were hidden by people fleeing Jerusalem when the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 CE. And that brings us to what just happened in 2024. A team of archaeologists went back to the same area where the original scrolls were found. They used ground-penetrating radar and other modern technology that wasn't available back in the 1940s and 50s. And what they discovered is absolutely insane. They found another cave. But not just any cave. This one had been completely sealed off by a rockfall that happened centuries ago, which means nobody has touched what's inside since ancient times. When they finally broke through, they found more scroll fragments. But here's what's blowing everyone's minds. These new fragments contain texts that directly contradict some of the interpretations we've had for decades. One fragment appears to be a calendar system that's completely different from what we thought these ancient communities used. This matters because it changes when they would have celebrated religious festivals, which means it changes how they understood sacred time itself. Another fragment contains a version of a biblical story that has significant differences from what made it into the official Bible. We're talking about changed details, different names, and events that happened in a different order. But the most controversial fragment is what appears to be a letter. And this letter suggests that the community that wrote the scrolls was in direct communication with other groups across the ancient world. This completely destroys the idea that they were isolated hermits living alone in the desert. Think about what this means. If these communities were networked together, sharing ideas and texts, then the Dead Sea Scrolls might not represent one weird fringe group. They might represent a much larger movement that influenced early Judaism and Christianity way more than we ever realized. Now, some scholars are already pushing back hard against these interpretations. They're saying we need more time to analyze the fragments, that we shouldn't jump to conclusions. But here's what makes this different. Multiple independent teams have now examined these fragments. The initial carbon dating places them right in the same time period as the original scrolls. The writing style matches. The materials match. So let's talk about what this could mean for how we understand the Bible itself. The Dead Sea Scrolls have always been important because they're the oldest copies of biblical texts we have. Before they were found, our oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscript was from around 1000 CE, the scrolls pushed that back over 1,000 years. When scholars compared the scroll versions to the later versions, they found they were remarkably similar. This was used as evidence that the biblical text had been preserved accurately over time. But the new fragments are showing variations that we hadn't seen before, small changes that might seem insignificant, but actually alter the meaning in important ways. For example, one fragment contains a version of a psalm that includes an extra verse. This verse changes the entire tone of the psalm from one of despair to one of hope. Imagine if a piece of literature you'd studied your whole life suddenly had a different ending. Another fragment suggests that certain prophetic books were still being edited and revised during the time these scrolls were written. This goes against the traditional view that the biblical canon was basically fixed by that point. What this means is that the Bible as we know it today went through way more changes and revisions than most people realize. It wasn't handed down perfectly from ancient times. It was a living document that different communities were actively debating and modifying. Now, if you're religious, this might sound threatening, but actually, many religious scholars are saying this makes the texts even more interesting. It shows real people wrestling with big questions. Let's talk about the community behind these scrolls, because that's where things get really wild. The letter fragment I mentioned earlier contains references to locations all over the ancient Near East. We're talking about places in Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. This suggests that whatever group wrote these scrolls was part of a much larger network of similar communities. They were exchanging letters, sharing copies of texts, and coordinating their beliefs and practices. Some researchers are now proposing that what we're looking at isn't one sect, but an entire movement that spread across multiple countries. A movement that rejected the mainstream religious establishment. And here's where it connects to early Christianity. Many of the ideas in the Dead Sea Scrolls show up in early Christian writings. The concept of a community of believers waiting for the end times. The idea of a teacher of righteousness who was persecuted. The emphasis on baptism and ritual purity. For decades, scholars have debated whether Jesus or his followers had contact with the groups that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. The new evidence is making that connection look much more likely. If these communities were networked across the region, and if John the Baptist was operating in the same area, and if early Christian communities shared so many similar ideas, then maybe the influence went both ways. Maybe early Christianity didn't emerge in isolation. Maybe it grew out of this larger movement of alternative Jewish groups who are all questioning the mainstream religious establishment. This doesn't mean Jesus wasn't a scene, or that Christianity is just a version of the Dead Sea Scroll community's beliefs. But it does mean that the religious landscape of first-century Judea was way more diverse and interconnected than we thought. Now let's talk about something that's been causing huge arguments among scholars. Some of the new fragments contain references to figures that don't appear in the Bible at all. One fragment mentions a teacher or prophet that nobody can identify. Another mentions conflicts with groups that we can't match to any known historical factions. The exciting interpretation is that we're discovering a whole hidden layer of history that's been lost for 2,000 years. Groups and individuals who were important at the time but didn't make it into the official historical record. But here's what we can say for sure. The religious and political situation in ancient Judea was way more complicated than a simple story of mainstream Judaism versus a few fringe groups. There were multiple competing versions of what it meant to be Jewish, multiple interpretations of the Torah, multiple expectations about the Messiah and the end times. Let's get into some of the specific texts that have scholars freaking out. One of the new fragments appears to be a previously unknown apocalyptic text. It describes visions of the end times that are similar to the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation, but with some major differences. In this text, the final battle between good and evil involves not just angels and demons, but also very specific human groups that can actually be identified historically. This suggests the author thought the apocalypse was going to happen in their lifetime. Another fragment is a set of legal rulings on religious law that are way stricter than anything in mainstream Judaism. We're talking about rules for everyday life that would have made normal living almost impossible. This tells us something important about how dedicated these communities were. They weren't just theoretically devoted to purity and righteousness. They were actually trying to live it out in every single aspect of their lives. There's also a fragment that appears to be a commentary on the biblical book of Habakkuk. Now, we already had a Habakkuk commentary in the original Dead Sea Scrolls, but this one is different. It interprets the same biblical text in a completely different way. This shows that even within these communities, there wasn't complete agreement on what the sacred texts meant. Different teachers had different interpretations. One of the most interesting fragments is what appears to be a personal letter from one member of the community to another. It talks about daily life, struggles with following the strict rules, doubts about whether the prophecies would really come true. This is incredibly rare in ancient texts. Usually what survives is official religious documents, not personal correspondence. Getting this glimpse into what someone actually thought and felt 2,000 years ago is extraordinarily valuable. It humanizes these ancient people in a way that formal religious texts never can. They were real people with doubts and hopes and struggles, trying to make sense of their world just like we do. Now, we need to talk about the controversy that's already brewing around these discoveries. Whenever new Dead Sea Scroll material is announced, there's always skepticism, and for good reason. In 2002, there was a huge scandal when fragments that were supposedly new Dead Sea Scrolls turned out to be modern forgeries. So scholars are being very careful this time. Every fragment is being subjected to rigorous testing. Multiple labs are doing independent carbon dating. The ink is being chemically analyzed. So far, everything is checking out. But the scientific community is still in the early stages of verification. It'll take months or even years before there's complete consensus. There's also controversy about the interpretation of what the fragments actually say. Ancient Hebrew and Aramaic can be tricky to translate, especially when you're dealing with fragments that are damaged and incomplete. Different scholars are proposing different readings of the same texts. Some see revolutionary new information. Others think the fragments are being censored. But regardless of how the specific details shake out, one thing is clear. The discovery of new Dead Sea Scroll material, especially from a sealed cave, is a massive deal. Now, you might be wondering why these scrolls were hidden in caves in the first place. The most likely explanation is that they were hidden during the Jewish revolt against Rome between 66 and 70 CE. This was a catastrophic war that ended with the Romans destroying the temple in Jerusalem. Groups throughout Judea were hiding valuable items, including religious texts, hoping to retrieve them after the war ended. But many people never made it back. The scrolls remained hidden for 2,000 years. The fact that they went to such lengths to preserve these texts tells us how important they were to them. These weren't just books. They were their community's most treasured possessions. Hiding them in desert caves, laid in jars, was an act of both desperation and hope. Desperation because they knew destruction was coming. Hope because they believed that somehow, someday, their truth would be found and understood. And now, 2 millennia later, we're proving them right. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The preservation of these scrolls is a miracle of climate and circumstance. The Dead Sea region is one of the driest places on Earth. The extreme aridity prevented the scrolls from decomposing the way they would have in almost any other climate. The clay jars they were sealed in also helped protect them from light and moisture. The caves themselves provided stable temperatures and protection from the elements. It's remarkable that such fragile materials survived at all. We're talking about pieces of leather and papyrus that are over 2,000 years old. But it also means that what has survived is just a tiny fraction of what once existed. For every scroll that made it to modern times, countless others were lost. What we have is a small window into a much larger world of ancient texts and ideas that we can only imagine. So, where do we go from here? First, the fragments will continue to be studied and analyzed. More scholars will weigh in. More tests will be conducted. More translations and interpretations will be proposed. Eventually, the fragments will be published in full, with photographs and detailed analysis available to anyone who wants to study them. Other teams will likely return to the Dead Sea region to search for more caves and more scrolls. If one sealed cave survived, there might be others. The technology for discovering and analyzing ancient texts keeps improving. Ground-penetrating radar, multispectral imaging, DNA analysis of the leather. All of these tools are getting better. We're probably going to see more discoveries in the coming years, and each one will add to our understanding of this crucial period in history. But here's the bigger picture. These discoveries remind us that history is not a closed book. We don't know everything about the past. There are still mysteries to uncover, still questions to answer. The ancient world was far more complex, diverse, and interesting than we often give it credit for. The people who lived back then were just as thoughtful, just as passionate, just as human as we are today. When we find fragments of their writings hidden in caves for 2,000 years, we're not just discovering historical artifacts. We're connecting with real people across a vast gulf of time. And sometimes, what they have to tell us challenges everything we thought we knew. That's what makes archaeology and historical research so important. Every discovery has the potential to rewrite the textbooks, to change our understanding, to reveal new truths about who we are and where we came from. The new Dead Sea Scrolls discovery is doing exactly that. It's forcing scholars to reconsider long-held theories. It's opening up new questions that nobody had thought to ask. Whether you're religious or secular, whether you're a scholar or just someone interested in history, these discoveries matter. They're part of the ongoing human quest to understand our past. The scrolls that were hidden in those caves 2,000 years ago are finally telling their secrets. And what they're revealing is going to keep scholars busy for decades to come. If this fascinates you, hit subscribe for more.